boat, an old one, which the new one had replaced, and which had been bought for a floating warehouse by an aged fisherman, had departed to the rescue of a Norwegian barque, the Hjalmar, round the bend of the Little Orme. "Let's go on the pier," said Denry. "It'll be splendid." He was not an hour in the town, and yet he was already hanging expense. "They've closed the pier," the girls told him. But when, in the course of their meanderings among the excited crowd under the gas lamps, they arrived at the pier gates, Denry perceived figures on the pier. "They're sailors and things, and the Mayor," the girls explained. "Pooh!" said Denry, fired. He approached the turnstile, and handed a card to the official. It was the card of an advertisement agent of the Staffordshire Signal, who had called at Brougham Street in Denry's absence, about the renewal of Denry's advertisement. "Press," said Denry to the guardian at the turnstile, and went through with the ease of a bird on the wing. "Come along," he cried to the girls. The guardian seemed to hesitate. "These ladies are with me," he said. The guardian yielded. It was a triumph for Denry. He could read his triumph in the eyes of his companions. When she looked at him like that, Ruth was assuredly marvellous among women, and any ideas derogatory to her marvellousness, which he might have had at Bursley and in the train, were false ideas. At the head of the pier beyond the pavilion there were gathered together some 50 people, and the tale ran that the second lifeboat had successfully accomplished its mission and was approaching the pier. "I shall write an account of this for the Signal," said Denry, whose thoughts were excusably on the press. "Oh, do!" exclaimed Nellie. "They have the Signal at all the newspaper shops here," said Ruth. Then they seemed to be merged in the storm. The pier shook and trembled under the shock of the waves, and occasionally, though the tide was very low, a sprinkle of water flew up and caught their faces. The eyes could see nothing save the passing glitter of the foam on the crest of a breaker. It was the most thrilling situation that any of them had ever been in. And at last came word from the mouths of men who could apparently see as well in the dark as in daylight, that the second lifeboat was close to the pier. And then everybody momentarily saw it, a ghostly thing that heaved up pale out of the murk for an instant and was lost again. And the little crowd cheered. The next moment a Bengal light illuminated the pier, and the lifeboat was silhouetted with strange effectiveness against the storm. And someone flung a rope, and then another rope arrived out of the sea and fell on Denry's shoulder. "Haul on there!" yelled a hoarse voice. The Bengal light expired. Denry hauled with a will. The occasion was unique, and those few seconds were worth to him the whole of Denry's previous life. Yes, not excluding the seconds in which he had kissed Ruth, and the minutes in which he had danced with the Countess of Chell. Then 2 men with beards took the rope from his hands. The air was now alive with shoutings. Finally there was a rush of men down the iron stairway to the lower part of the pier, 10 feet nearer the water. "You stay here, you two," Denry ordered. "But, Denry..." "Stay here, I tell you." All the male in him was aroused. He was off, after the rush of men. "Half a jiffy," he said, coming back. "Just take charge of this, will you?" And he poured into their hands about 12 shillings worth of copper, small change of rents, from his hip pocket. "If anything happened, that might sink me," he said, and vanished. It was very characteristic of him, that effusion of calm sagacity in a supreme emergency. 4. Beyond getting his feet wet, Denry accomplished but little in the dark basement of the pier. In spite of his success in hauling in the thrown rope, he seemed to be classed at once down there by the experts assembled as an eager and useless person who had no right to the space which he occupied. However, he witnessed the heaving arrival of the lifeboat and the disembarking of the rescued crew of the Norwegian barque, and he was more than ever decided to compose a descriptive article for the Staffordshire Signal. The rescued and rescuing crews disappeared in single file to the upper floor of the pier, with the exception of the coxswain, a man with a spreading red beard, who stayed behind to inspect the lifeboat, of which, indeed, he was the absolute owner. As a journalist, Denry did the correct thing and engaged him in conversation. Meanwhile cheering could be heard above. The coxswain, who stated that his name was Cregeen, and that he was a Manxman, seemed to regret the entire expedition. He seemed to be unaware that it was his duty now to play the part of the modest hero to Denry's interviewing. At every loose end of the chat he would say gloomily, "And look at her now, I'm telling ye," meaning the battered craft, which rose and fell on the black waves. Denry ran upstairs again, in search of more amenable material. Some 20 men, in various sou'westers and other headgear, were eating thick slices of bread and butter and drinking hot coffee, which, with foresight, had been prepared for them in the pier buffet. A few had preferred whisky. The whole crowd was now under the lee of the pavilion, and it constituted a spectacle which Denry said to himself he should refer to in his article as Rembrandtesque. For a few moments he could not descry Ruth and Nellie in the gloom. Then he saw the indubitable form of his betrothed at a penny in the slot machine, and the indubitable form of Nellie at another penny in the slot machine, and then he could hear the click, click, click of the machines working rapidly, and his thoughts took a new direction. Presently Ruth ran with blithe gracefulness from her machine and commenced a generous distribution of packets to the members of the crew. There was neither calculation nor exact justice in her generosity. She dropped packets on to heroic knees with a splendid gesture of largesse. Some packets even fell on the floor, but she did not mind. Denry could hear her saying, "You must eat it. Chocolate is so sustaining, there's nothing like it." She ran back to the machines and snatched more packets from Nellie, who under her orders had been industrious, and then began a second distribution. A calm and disinterested observer would probably have been touched by this spectacle of impulsive womanly charity. He might even have decided that it was one of the most beautifully human things that he had ever seen. And the fact that the hardy heroes and Norsemen appeared scarcely to know what to do with the silver-wrapped bonbons would not have impaired his admiration for these two girlish figures of benevolence. Denry, too, was touched by the spectacle, but in another way. It was the rents of his clients that were being thus dissipated in the very luxury of needless benevolence. He muttered, "Well, that's a bit thick, that is." But of course he could do nothing. As the process continued, the clicking of the machine exacerbated his ears. "Idiotic!" he muttered. The final annoyance to him was that everybody except himself seemed to consider that Ruth was displaying singular ingenuity, originality, enterprise, and goodness of heart. In that moment he saw clearly for the first time that the marriage between himself and Ruth had not been arranged in heaven. He admitted privately that the saving of a young woman from violent death in a pantechnicon need not inevitably involve espousing her. She was without doubt a marvellous creature, but it was as wise to dream of keeping a carriage and pair as to dream of keeping Ruth. He grew suddenly cynical. His age leapt to 50 or so, and the curve of his lips changed. Ruth, spying around, saw him and ran to him with a glad cry. "Here," she said, "take these. They're no good." She held out her hands. "What are they?" he asked. "They're the halfpennies." "So sorry," he said, with an accent whose significance escaped her, and took the useless coins. "We've exhausted all the chocolate," said she, "but there's butterscotch left. It's nearly as good. And gold-tipped cigarettes. I dare say some of them would enjoy a smoke. Have you got any more pennies?" "No," he replied, "but I've got 10 or a dozen half-crowns. They'll work the machine just as well, won't they?" This time she did notice a certain unusualness in the flavour of his accent, and she hesitated. "Don't be silly," she said. "I'll try not to be," said Denry. So far as he could remember, he had never used such a tone before. Ruth swerved away to rejoin Nellie. Denry surreptitiously counted the halfpennies. There were 18. She had fed those machines, then, with over 130 pence. He murmured, "Thick, thick." Considering that he had returned to Llandudno in the full intention of putting his foot down, of clearly conveying to Ruth that his conception of finance differed from hers, the second sojourn had commenced badly. Still, he had promised to marry her, and he must marry her. Better a lifetime of misery and insolvency than a failure to behave as a